This belief very soon gave rise to certain rules of conduct. Since the dead had need of food and drink, it appeared to be a duty of the living to satisfy this need. The care of supplying the dead with sustenance was not left to the caprice or to the variable sentiments of men. It was obligatory. Thus, a complete religion of the dead was established, whose dogmas might soon be effaced, but whose rites endured until the triumph of Christianity. The dead were held to be sacred beings. To them the ancients applied the most respectful epithets that could be thought of. They called them good, holy, happy. For them, they had all the veneration that man can have for the divinity whom he loves or fears. In their thoughts, the dead were gods. This sort of apotheosis was not the privilege of great men. No distinction was made among the dead. Cicero says our ancestors desired that the men who had quitted this life should be counted in the number of the gods. If it was not necessary to have been even a virtuous man, the wicked man as well as the good man became a god. But he retained in the second life all the bad inclinations which had tormented him in the first. The Greeks gave to the dead the name of subterranean gods. In Aeschylus, a son thus invokes his deceased father, "O thou who art a god beneath the earth." Euripides says, speaking of Alcestis, "Near her tomb the passer-by will stop and say, 'This is now a thrice happy divinity.'" The Romans gave to the dead the name of manes. "Render to the manes what is due them," says Cicero. They are men who have quitted this life. Consider them as divine beings. The tombs were the temples of these divinities, and they bore the sacramental inscription, "Dis manibus," and in Greek. There the god lived beneath the soil. "Manesque sepulti," says Virgil. Before the tomb there was an altar for the sacrifices, as before the temples of the gods. We find this worship of the dead among the Hellenists, among the Latins, among the Sabines. Among the Etruscans, we also find it among the Aryas of India. Mention is made of it in the hymns of the Rig Veda. It is spoken of in the laws of Manu as the most ancient worship among men. We see in this book that the idea of metempsychosis had already passed over this ancient belief, and before the religion of Brahma was established. And still beneath the worship of Brahma, beneath the doctrine of metempsychosis, the religion of the souls of ancestors still subsists, living and indestructible, and compels the author of the laws of Manu to take it into account and to admit its rules into the sacred book. Not the least singular thing about this strange book is that it has preserved the rules relative to this ancient belief, whilst it was evidently prepared in an age when a belief entirely different had gained the ascendancy. This proves that much time is required to transform a human belief, and still more to modify its exterior forms and the laws based upon it. At the present day, even after so many ages of revolutions, the Hindus continue to make offerings to their ancestors. This belief and these rites are the oldest and the most persistent of anything pertaining to the Indo-European race. This worship was the same in India as in Greece, and Italy. The Hindu had to supply the manes with the repast, which was called shraddha. Let the master of the house make the shraddha with rice, milk, roots, and fruits in order to procure for himself the good will of the manis. The Hindu believed that at the moment where he offered this funeral repast, the manis of his ancestors came to seat themselves beside him and took the nourishment which was offered them. He also believed that this repast afforded the dead great enjoyment. When the shraddha is made according to the rites, the ancestors of the one who offers it experience unbounded satisfaction. Thus, the areas of the East had, in the beginning, the same notions as those of the West, relative to man's destiny after death. Before believing in metempsychosis, which supposes an absolute distinction between the soul and the body, they believed in the vague and indefinite existence of man, invisible but not immaterial, and requiring of mortals nourishment and offering. The Hindu, like the Greek, regarded the dead as divine beings who enjoyed a happy existence. But their happiness depended on the condition that the offerings made by the living should be carried to them regularly. If the shraddha for a dead person was not offered regularly, his soul left its peaceful dwelling and became a wandering spirit who tormented the living. So that if the dead were really gods, this was only whilst the living honored them with their worship. The Greeks and Romans had exactly the same belief. If the funeral repast ceased to be offered to the dead, they immediately left their tombs and became wandering shades. That were heard in the silence of the night. They reproached the living with their negligence, or they sought to punish them by afflicting them with diseases, or cursing their soil with sterility. In a word, they left the living no rest till the funeral feasts were re-established. The sacrifice, the offering of nourishment, and the libations restored them to the tomb and gave them back their rest and their divine attributes. Man was then at peace with them. Thus in Aeschylus, Clytemnestra, warned by a dream that the manes of Agamemnon are irritated against her, hastens to send offerings to his tomb. If a deceased person, on being neglected, became a malignant spirit, one who was honored became, on the other hand, a tutelary deity. He loved those who brought him nourishment. To protect them, he continued to take part in human affairs and frequently played an important part there. Dead though he was, he knew how to be strong and active. The living prayed to him and asked his support and his favors. When any one came near a tomb, he stopped and said, "Subterranean God, be propitious to me." Euripides. They believe that if we have no care for these dead, and if we neglect their worship, they will do us harm, and that on the contrary, they do us good if we render them propitious to us by offerings. We can judge of the power which the ancients attributed to the dead by this prayer which Electra addresses to the manes of her father. "Take pity on me and on my brother Orestes. Make him return to this country. Hear my prayer. O Father, grant my wishes, receiving my libations." These powerful gods did not give material aid only, for Electra adds, "Give me a heart more chaste than my mother's and purer hands." Thus, the Hindu asks of the manes that in his family the number of good men may increase, and that he may have much to give. These human souls, deified by death, were what the Greeks called demons, or heroes. The primitive sense of this last word appears to have been that of dead men. The language of the inscription, which is that of the common people among the Greeks, often employs it in this sense. The Greeks also gave to one the name. The Latins gave them the name of lares, manes, geni. Our ancestors believed, says Apuleius, that the manes, when they were malignant, were to be called larvae. They called them lares when they were benevolent and propitious. Elsewhere we read, genius and lar is the same being. So our ancestors believed. And in Cicero, those that the Greeks called demons, we call lares. This religion of the dead appears to be the oldest that has existed among this race of men. Before men had any notion of Indra or of Zeus, they adored the dead. They feared them and addressed them prayers. It seems that the religious sentiment commenced in this way. It was perhaps while looking upon the dead that man first conceived the idea of the supernatural, and began to have a hope beyond what he saw. Death was the first mystery, and it placed man on the track of other mysteries. It raised his thoughts from the visible to the invisible, from the transitory to the eternal, from the human to the divine. In the house of every Greek and Roman was an altar. In the house of every Greek and Roman In the house of every Greek and Roman was an altar. On this altar there had always been a small quantity of ashes and a few lighted coals. The Greeks called this altar by various names. This last finally prevailed in use and was the name by which they afterwards designated the goddess Vesta. The Latins called the same altar Ara or Focus. It was a sacred obligation for the master of every house to keep the fire up night and day. Woe to the house where it was extinguished. Every evening they covered the coals with ashes to prevent them from being entirely consumed. In the morning the first care was to receive. In the morning the first care was to revive this fire with a few twigs. The fire ceased to glow upon the altar only when the entire family had perished. An extinguished hearth, an extinguished family were synonymous expressions among the ancients. It is evident that this usage of keeping fire always upon an altar was connected with an ancient belief. The rules and the rites which they observed in regard to it show that it was not an insignificant custom. It was not permitted to feed this fire with every sort of wood. Religion distinguished among the trees those that could be employed for this use from those it was impiety to make use of. It was also a religious precept that this fire must always remain pure, which meant literally that no filthy object ought to be cast into it, and figuratively, that no blameworthy deed ought to be committed in its presence. There was one day in the year among the Romans, it was the 1st of March, when it was the duty of every family to put out its sacred fire and light another immediately. But to procure this new fire, certain rites had to be scrupulously observed. Especially must they avoid using flint and steel for this purpose. The only processes allowed were to concentrate the solar rays into a focus, or to rub together rapidly 2 pieces of wood of a given sort. These different rules sufficiently prove that, in the opinion of the ancients, it was not a question of procuring an element useful and agreeable. These men saw something else in the fire that burnt upon their altars. This fire was something divine. They adored it and offered it a real worship. They made offerings to it of whatever they believed to be agreeable to a god. Flowers, fruits, incense, wine, and victims. They believed it to have power and asked for its protection. They addressed fervent prayers to it to obtain those eternal objects of human desire: health, wealth, and happiness. One of these prayers, which has been preserved to us in the collection of Orphic hymns, runs thus: render us always prosperous, always happy, O fire, thou who art eternal, beautiful, ever young, thou who nourishest, thou who art rich, receive favorably these our offerings, and in return give us happiness and sweet health. Thus they saw in the fire a beneficent God who maintained the life of man, a rich God who nourished him with gifts, a powerful God who protected his house and family.